The plane was already crowded, the kind of narrow-body flight where every inch of space felt negotiated before anyone even sat down. Overhead bins slammed shut. Seatbelts clicked. A low, restless murmur filled the cabin as passengers waited for departure. Then it happened. A man in his late 50s, well-dressed, rigid with entitlement, froze in the aisle and pointed sharply at the seat beside him. His voice cut through the noise, loud enough for half the plane to hear. "I'm not sitting next to her. Move her." Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Phones paused mid-scroll. The woman he pointed at didn't flinch. She stayed seated, hands still, eyes forward. No argument. No explanation. Just silence. That silence made the moment heavier than shouting ever could. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's go back to our main character. She was seated in an economy plus row on a domestic flight, the kind with just enough legroom to feel earned but never guaranteed. She had boarded early, scanned her pass without issue, and taken her seat like any other passenger. She didn't look around for approval. She didn't announce herself. She simply sat down. The man beside her, however, leaned into the aisle as if contaminated by proximity. "This isn't about preference," he snapped when a flight attendant approached. "It's about comfort. And safety." That word lingered in the air. Safety. A few passengers exchanged looks. One woman across the aisle stiffened. Another man pretended not to hear. The flight attendant hesitated, trained to de-escalate, unsure which version of calm the airline expected from her. The woman remained still. She'd heard this before, in conference halls, in labs, in places where she was assumed to be an exception or an error. The man kept going, growing bolder with every second no one stopped him. "Why is she even here?" he said, his voice dropping into something sharper. "There are other seats." That was when an air marshal stepped forward from the back of the cabin. His presence sudden and unmistakable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anyone. He simply stood beside the aisle, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the scene. "Sir," he said evenly, "what seems to be the problem?" The man gestured again, openly now. "Her. I don't want to sit next to her." The air marshal turned toward the woman for the first time. "Ma'am," he said, measured and professional, "may I see your identification?" A ripple ran through the cabin. Some people leaned in. Others looked away. The question itself landed heavier than the insult. Why her? Why now? She finally moved, reaching calmly into her bag. No rush. No protest. Just a quiet decision to end the guessing. When she handed over her ID, the air marshal looked down and paused. Not for long. Just long enough. His posture changed. His tone shifted. And in that moment, the balance of power inside that cabin began to turn. The pause that followed felt longer than it was. The kind of silence that stretches because everyone senses something has shifted, but no one yet knows how far it will go. And as the air marshal handed the identification back to her without a word, the man beside her scoffed and crossed his arms as if daring the moment to challenge him, muttering that credentials did not change comfort, that rules were rules, that he had rights too. And the flight attendant, still hovering, glanced between them. With a rehearsed smile that could not hide the tension settling into her shoulders, because this was no longer a simple seating dispute, it was a test of whose discomfort mattered more, and the cabin knew it. The woman across the aisle tightened her grip on the armrest. A teenager a few rows back leaned forward pretending to look for something in the seat pocket just to listen, and the air marshal finally spoke again, calm but firmer now, reminding the man that boarding needed to continue, and that everyone had assigned seats. Yet the man laughed softly and said that people like him should not be forced into situations that made him uneasy, that airlines should think about who they place next to paying customers, and that comment rippled outward, not loud enough to be announced, but sharp enough to land, because it carried a history everyone recognized even if no one named it. And the woman remained still, eyes forward, breathing measured, because she had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only fed the spectacle. She had learned that in her first year of graduate school when a professor asked if she was lost in the lab, that in the years that followed, she would be mistaken for staff, for assistants, for anyone but the lead engineer whose name appeared on the published work. And those memories did not arrive with drama. They arrived like data points lining up, forming a familiar pattern that required no emotion to interpret. And as the man continued, now explaining to the attendant that there must be another seat, somewhere else, anywhere else, the air marshal raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to slow the moment, and asked him to lower his voice, reminding him that disorder on a plane had consequences, which only seemed to irritate the man further as he complained that he was being threatened for expressing an opinion, that he was being made uncomfortable for speaking the truth. And at that word truth, the woman finally turned her head just enough to look at the aisle, not at the man, but at the growing cluster of eyes watching her, measuring her, deciding what they would say later about where they stood. And the flight attendant cleared her throat and offered, carefully, that perhaps the man could change seats if there was availability. An attempt at compromise that revealed exactly how these moments often ended, with the burden of adjustment placed quietly on the one being targeted. And a low murmur moved through the rows as some passengers nodded and others frowned. And the air marshal glanced at the attendant, then back at the man, and said that if anyone was to move, it would be done according to policy, not preference. And the man snapped that policy should protect customers like him, customers who paid for peace. And at that the woman spoke for the first time since boarding, her voice steady, not raised, not defensive, simply clear, asking whether peace was defined by distance from her. And the question hung there, unanswered, because it forced something into the open that had been implied but never stated. And the cabin shifted again, a few heads lowering, a few eyes meeting hers for the first time, not with curiosity, but recognition. And the air marshal straightened slightly, as if reminded of his role not just to manage disruption, but to read it. And he asked the man once more to cooperate, explaining that refusal could delay the flight, could escalate matters. And that was when the man waved a dismissive hand and said that delays were worth it if principles were involved. And in that moment the woman felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, but resolve, because she knew how this pattern usually concluded. She knew that compliance was often framed as maturity and resistance as aggression. And she also knew that this flight, this seat, this moment, were not anomalies. They were intersections. And as the engines hummed louder and the door remained open, she understood that whatever happened next would not only determine where she sat, but how this cabin would remember what it chose to tolerate. The delay stretched on, no longer measured in minutes, but in glances, in the way the air inside the cabin seemed to thicken as boarding halted, and the open door remained a reminder that everyone was waiting on a decision that should never have belonged to one man's comfort. And the man knew it. He felt the attention shifting toward him and mistook it for validation, straightening his posture as if the crowd were an audience meant to affirm his stance, repeating that he was not refusing the flight, only refusing the situation, framing himself as reasonable while casting her presence as the disruption. And the flight attendant, voice carefully neutral, attempted again to redirect him toward cooperation, explaining that the aircraft could not depart while an active dispute remained unresolved. Yet her words slid past him because he was no longer negotiating with staff, he was performing. And a few rows back someone whispered that this was ridiculous, while another person whispered that it was safer to stay quiet. And that divide, so familiar, settled into the cabin like an unspoken rule, because neutrality in moments like this always had a cost, and it was never paid by the loudest voice. The woman sat upright, shoulders relaxed, refusing to shrink or expand herself to match the tension, her calm now misread as defiance by the man, who scoffed and asked aloud why she was not saying anything, why she was pretending this was normal. And when no one answered him, he added that silence was suspicious, that people who belonged did not need to sit so stiffly. And the ugliness of that assumption landed harder than his earlier remarks, because it stripped away pretense and revealed what he believed silence meant. And the air marshal stepped slightly closer, positioning himself not between them, but near enough to signal that this had crossed from inconvenience into conduct, reminding the man that continued commentary directed at another passenger could be considered harassment. And at that word harassment the man laughed sharply and said that everyone was too sensitive now, that you could not even speak your mind without being labeled. and a low exhale rippled through the cabin, part exhaustion, part recognition, because the script was familiar, and the woman finally spoke again, not to argue, but to state, clearly and evenly, that she had followed every instruction, boarded when called, taken the seat assigned to her, and that she had not addressed him until he addressed her. And the simplicity of those facts made them difficult to dismiss. And for the first time the flight attendant looked directly at her, really looked, as if recalibrating the story she had been absorbing, and nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of what had been said, which only infuriated the man further as he demanded to know why his discomfort was being minimized, why he was being lectured while she was protected, and the air marshal answered him, plainly, saying that no one was being protected, but that behavior mattered, and that the flight would not move forward until the situation was resolved. And with that the man threatened to file complaints, to call customer service, to make sure someone paid for the delay, insisting that he would not back down, because backing down would mean admitting he was wrong. And that was the one thing he could not afford in front of an audience that had begun to shift away from him. And the woman felt the familiar weight of collective anticipation, the sense that people were waiting for her to either reassure them or confirm their fears, and she chose neither. She simply remained present, because she understood that this was no longer about convincing anyone. It was about revealing something. And as the engines idled and the overhead lights hummed, a quiet realization spread through the rows that this was not a private disagreement. It was a public measure of what would be tolerated. And the air marshal, eyes steady, made a decision, reaching again for his radio, signaling that the next step was no longer optional. And as he did, the man's confidence flickered for the first time, replaced by irritation edged with uncertainty, while the woman felt something else entirely, not triumph, not anger, but clarity, because she knew that whatever came next would force the truth into the open, and once that happened, there would be no returning to the illusion that this was just about a seat. The radio click was soft but unmistakable, a sound that carried authority without spectacle, and as the air marshal lowered his hand, the cabin seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that the moment had crossed an invisible threshold, because radios were not used for preferences, they were used for problems, and the man noticed it too, his voice tightening as he asked whether this was really necessary, whether things were not being taken too far, and for the first time his certainty cracked just enough to reveal concern beneath it, while the flight attendant stepped back half a pace, giving space not to the man but to the process unfolding. And that shift did not go unnoticed by a woman seated 2 rows up on the aisle, who had been watching quietly since the first raised voice, her hands folded tightly in her lap, jaws set as if holding something back, and now she exhaled and spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough to cut through the murmur, saying that she had seen the woman, bored like everyone else, that she had taken her assigned seat, that nothing about this situation looked like a threat until it was made one. And the sentence landed with a different weight because it did not come from authority or policy. It came from a witness, and a man across the aisle nodded, adding that he had heard the comment about safety and that it did not sit right. That words mattered, especially in a place where no one could simply walk away, and the cabin shifted again, this time, not toward tension but toward alignment, as if something unspoken had finally been allowed to surface. And the man beside the woman reacted sharply, telling them to mind their business, insisting that he was entitled to his feelings, that discomfort did not need permission, but his protest no longer filled the space the way it had before, because it was now competing with something stronger, shared recognition, and the air marshal looked from the speakers back to the woman at the center of it all, noting how she had not appealed to anyone, had not asked for defense, had not changed her posture even as others stepped in, and that restraint carried its own credibility, and the flight attendant, emboldened by the support, spoke more firmly now, stating that harassment of any passenger was against policy, and that continued refusal to comply could result in removal from the flight. And at the word removal the man stiffened, scoffing that no one would dare remove him for telling the truth, that this was exactly what was wrong now, that facts were being punished, and the woman finally turned more fully toward him, not confrontational, not pleading, simply present, and said that truth did not require volume, and that if his comfort depended on her absence, then the issue was not seating, it was belief, and the simplicity of that statement left no easy reply, because it did not accuse, it described, and the witnesses fell silent, allowing it to stand. And in that quiet the air marshal addressed the man again, stating that the flight could not continue until he either complied with seating or accepted reassignment himself, that this was not a debate, and the man looked around as if searching for support, for someone to validate his outrage, but found only eyes that no longer mirrored it, some avoiding him, others holding his gaze with something like disappointment, and his voice rose again, thinner now, claiming that he was being ganged up on, that this was unfair, that he was being judged, and the irony of that word hung there, heavy and unmissed, and the woman felt it too, not as satisfaction, but as a familiar ache, because she had seen this reversal before, the moment when accountability was mistaken for persecution, and as the air marshal prepared to speak into his radio again, the man's posture shifted, no longer expansive, no longer certain, and the cabin seemed to breathe together, realizing that this was no longer about winning or losing. It was about whether the pattern would hold or finally break, and the woman, steady as ever, remained seated, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she understood that leaving would allow the moment to be explained away, softened, forgotten, and she was done with forgetting. And as the overhead lights hummed and the door remained open, the witnesses now fully awake, the cabin stood on the edge of a decision that would echo far beyond this flight, because once people chose to speak, silence could no longer pretend to be neutral. The moment stretched inward rather than outward, as if the cabin had stopped moving forward in time and begun folding back on itself. And while the air marshal paused with his radio in hand, the woman felt a familiar shift inside her, the quiet transition from observation to recollection, because moments like this never existed alone. They arrived carrying others with them, layered and insistent. And as the man beside her continued to mutter about unfairness and targeting, his words began to blur into echoes of voices she had heard years before, voices that sounded different but carried the same assumptions. And she remembered being 23 years old, standing in the hallway of a research facility with a visitor badge clipped to her jacket, while a security guard asked her who she was waiting for, even though she had arrived early to prepare a presentation with her name printed on the agenda. And she remembered smiling then, explaining patiently, only to be asked again minutes later by someone else, as if repetition could make the doubt more reasonable. And she remembered the first time she realized that excellence did not shield her from suspicion, it only changed the language used to question her presence. And those memories did not overwhelm her now. They steadied her, because they had taught her what escalation looked like before it announced itself. And back in the cabin the flight attendant shifted her weight and asked the air marshal quietly whether ground support should be contacted, a procedural question that carried weight, because it signaled that this was no longer being handled as an inconvenience. And the man heard it and raised his voice again, insisting that he was being treated like a criminal, that he was being punished for saying what everyone else was thinking. And that comment drew a sharp inhale from somewhere behind them, followed by a woman saying, aloud now, that not everyone was thinking that some people were thinking this had gone too far, and the man snapped back that she was free to sit next to anyone she wanted, but that he had a choice too. And the woman replied that choice did not include humiliating someone in public, and the exchange sent a ripple through the rows, because it marked a turning point, the moment when silence gave way to consequence. And the air marshal stepped closer to the man, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone, explaining that continued refusal to comply with crew instructions could result in removal from the aircraft. And that statement landed differently than before, because it was no longer hypothetical. And the man laughed again, but this time the sound was brittle, and he said that this was unbelievable, that he had flown for decades without being spoken to this way. And the woman heard that and thought of another memory. Years later, after she had earned her doctorate, after she had led teams and published findings that changed how systems were designed, standing in line at a conference where a man behind her asked which company she worked for, and when she answered, asked again who she really worked for, and how she had felt that same tightness then, the awareness that no explanation would satisfy someone committed to disbelief. And she returned to the present as the air marshal asked the man one final time to lower his voice and comply, and instead the man pointed at her again, his frustration boiling over into accusation, saying that she was the reason for the delay, that if she had just moved, none of this would be happening. And something in that assertion crystallized the moment, because it exposed the expectation beneath it, that harmony required her erasure, and she finally stood, not abruptly, not defiantly, but with the same controlled precision she brought to everything she did, and the cabin quieted immediately, because movement after so much stillness carried meaning, and she said, clearly and calmly, that she would not move, that she had done nothing wrong, and that she would not accept blame for another person's inability to share space. And her voice did not shake, because she had practiced this resolve in rooms far more hostile than this one, and the air marshal nodded once, acknowledging her statement without commentary, and turned back to the man, informing him that he would now need to make a decision, either accept reassignment or disembark. And the word disembark hit the cabin like a dropped object, sudden and final, and the man's face flushed as he protested that this was outrageous, that he would escalate, that he would make calls, and the woman recognized that too, the last refuge of lost authority. And as the plane remained still and the door stayed open, she felt a deep certainty settle in, because she knew this was the breaking point, the place where patterns either repeated or were finally interrupted, and whatever happened next would not be forgotten by anyone watching. The cabin seemed to exhale and then tighten again as the air marshal held his position, radio now fully in hand, his voice low but deliberate as he requested ground coordination, not as a threat, but as procedure, and that distinction mattered because it stripped the moment of drama and replaced it with structure, something the man beside her could not argue his way around, and the flight attendant nodded and stepped aside, no longer negotiating, no longer offering alternatives meant to soothe, because the situation had moved past comfort and into compliance, and the man sensed it, his earlier bluster giving way to a restless agitation as he demanded to know who was being called, what was being reported, and whether his name was being written down, questions that revealed a sudden concern for record rather than righteousness, and the air marshal answered evenly that the delay and the refusal were being documented, that any further disruption would be handled accordingly, and the simplicity of that statement drained the color from the man's face because it left no room for argument, only consequence, and around them the passengers watched in a different way now, not leaning in for spectacle, but sitting back as if recognizing that this was no longer entertainment. It was accountability unfolding in real time, and the woman felt the shift too, a subtle but unmistakable change in the weight of the air, because she knew this stage well, the moment when authority stopped asking and started acting, and she returned to her seat slowly, deliberately, not retreating but grounding herself, signaling that she would not be moved by intimidation or escalation, and the air marshal acknowledged her with a brief nod before turning his full attention back to the man, explaining that ground personnel would be boarding to resolve the matter if he did not make a decision immediately, and the man laughed once more, but there was no humor in it now, only disbelief, as he said that this was insane, that the world had gone mad, that he was being punished for having standards, and a murmur moved through the cabin, not of agreement but of fatigue, because many had heard these words before in other places, spoken by other people when lines were finally drawn, and the woman felt a calm settle deeper within her, not the calm of detachment but of readiness, because she understood that this was the pivot, the point where systems revealed what they truly protected, and she reached into her bag again, not hurried, not defensive, and withdrew a slim folder she had not intended to use, holding it closed for now, resting it on her lap, and the air marshal noticed the movement and glanced at it briefly, then back at her face, registering something he could not yet name, and the man noticed too, his eyes flicking toward the folder with irritation, as if any action she took was a provocation, and he demanded to know what she was doing now, whether she was trying to make a scene, and she answered him for the first time directly, her voice steady, saying that she was preparing for what came next, because she had learned not to assume fairness but to be ready for scrutiny, and that statement landed quietly but firmly, because it reframed the entire encounter, not as a misunderstanding but as a predictable process, and the air marshal straightened further, his professional instincts sharpening as he recognized the composure of someone accustomed to systems, not intimidated by them, and he informed the man that ground support was en route, that the flight would remain delayed until the issue was resolved, and that refusal to cooperate could result in removal from the aircraft, and the man's protest escalated into anger now, his voice rising as he accused the crew of siding against him, of choosing optics over truth, of protecting her at his expense. And the irony of that accusation was not lost on the cabin, which had watched her endure the weight of assumption without complaint. And a few passengers shook their heads openly now, no longer hiding their reactions, and the flight attendant stepped forward again, her voice firmer than before, instructing the man to lower his voice and remain seated. And for the first time he hesitated, his authority slipping as he realized that every move he made was being noted, not just by staff, but by witnesses who would remember where they stood. And the woman felt no triumph in that moment, only resolve, because she knew that visibility did not equal justice. It only created the conditions for it. And as footsteps approached from the jet bridge and the murmur of ground personnel grew closer, she understood that the next phase was beginning, not one driven by emotion, but by process. And whatever was about to be revealed would not be shouted. It would be documented, and the cabin, now fully awake, waited in a charged silence for the truth to take its proper place. The footsteps from the jet bridge reached the threshold of the cabin and stopped, not entering yet, not interrupting, as if even the ground staff sensed that something decisive was about to surface. And in that suspended moment, the air marshal turned his attention fully to the woman, his tone shifting from procedural to precise as he asked her, quietly but clearly, whether she would consent to further verification to expedite resolution. And she nodded once, not because she needed permission to exist in that seat, but because she understood how systems moved when clarity was finally allowed to replace assumption. And she opened the slim folder on her lap, sliding out a single identification card in a document sleeve with practiced ease, her movements unhurried, controlled. And the air marshal took the card, his eyes dropping to it reflexively before lifting again, then returning to the card with sharper focus. And something in his posture changed instantly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, the way someone reacts when the ground beneath a situation suddenly reorganizes itself. And he did not speak at first, because speaking too quickly would have betrayed surprise, and the man beside her noticed the pause and scoffed, muttering that this was ridiculous, that credentials were being waved around to excuse special treatment. But his voice no longer carried authority, it carried anxiety. Because the pause was not confusion, it was recognition. And the air marshal straightened fully now, handing the card back to the woman with a level of respect that had not been present before. And then he turned, deliberately, so that his voice would carry to the rows around them without becoming an announcement. And he stated, clearly and without embellishment, that the passenger was a federally cleared aerospace engineer with active credentials tied to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the effect of those words was immediate and total, as if the cabin itself recalibrated, because titles have weight in spaces built on hierarchy. And this one carried institutional gravity, and the man's mouth opened slightly, then closed, his earlier certainty collapsing inward as he processed what had just been said. And someone behind them whispered a sharp intake of breath, while another passenger murmured an incredulous response. And the woman felt none of the vindication others might have expected, only a familiar stillness, because she had never needed the title to know who she was. And the air marshal continued, explaining that her identification had been verified, that her clearance exceeded standard passenger screening, and that there was no basis for further delay related to her presence. And then he turned to the man, his tone unchanged but his meaning unmistakable, and stated that the issue now rested solely with his refusal to comply with seating instructions. And the man stammered that he had not known, that no one had told him, that he could not have known. And the air marshal replied calmly that knowledge was never the requirement for respect, and that assumption did not excuse conduct. And the words landed hard because they stripped away the last refuge of ignorance. And the cabin remained silent, not out of shock, but out of collective understanding, because the reveal had not erased what had happened, it had illuminated it. And the woman looked forward again, no longer the subject of speculation but the axis around which the moment had turned. And she spoke once more, her voice steady and precise, stating that her work required collaboration across disciplines and backgrounds, that she shared space with people who did not look like her every day, and that professionalism meant showing up without requiring others to prove their worth. and her words were not a lecture, they were a statement of fact. And the man shrank slightly into his seat, his earlier bravado replaced by defensiveness as he muttered that he was being made an example of, and the air marshal responded that examples were created by actions, not by outcomes. And then he presented the man with the choice again, to accept reassignment without further disruption or to disembark, and this time there was no argument, only a long, tight breath as the man nodded stiffly, his defeat quiet but complete, and the ground staff finally stepped into the cabin to facilitate the reassignment, moving with efficiency rather than ceremony. And as the man gathered his belongings, avoiding eye contact with anyone, the woman remained seated, her posture unchanged, because the moment did not require her reaction. It required recognition, and as the aisle cleared and the process concluded, the cabin slowly resumed its low hum, not because everything was forgotten, but because something had been corrected, and the air marshal gave the woman a final nod before returning to his position, and in that small gesture was an acknowledgement not just of her credentials, but of the composure with which she had allowed the truth to surface on its own terms. And as the door finally closed and the aircraft prepared to depart, the passengers carried with them the quiet weight of what they had witnessed, understanding that this was never about a seat, but about what happens when assumptions meet reality and have nowhere left to hide. Once the man was escorted toward a different section of the aircraft, the emotional temperature of the cabin did not immediately cool, because moments like this do not resolve the instant the visible conflict ends. They linger, settling into the quiet spaces between strangers, and as the ground staff returned to the jet bridge and the aisle cleared, a hush remained, thicker now than before, charged with reflection rather than tension. And the woman stayed seated, fastening her seatbelt with the same unhurried precision she had shown throughout the ordeal, not performing relief, not seeking acknowledgement, because her work had taught her that resolution did not always come with applause. Sometimes it arrived with silence and the slow recalibration of how people looked at you. And around her the passengers shifted in their seats, some glancing her way with something like respect, others with discomfort, as if recognizing their own earlier hesitation, and a woman across the aisle leaned slightly forward and offered a quiet apology, not for what she had done, but for what she had not done sooner. And the woman met her eyes and nodded once, accepting the gesture without comment, because she understood that awareness often arrived after the moment passed, and that too was part of the process. And the flight attendant returned, her tone noticeably different now, more assured, thanking the woman for her patience and confirming that boarding would resume immediately. And there was no mention of inconvenience or delay, only acknowledgement, which mattered more than explanation. And the air marshal took his position again, scanning the cabin not for threats but for readiness, his presence now part of the background rather than the focus. And as the door finally closed with a muted thud, the engines grew louder and the aircraft began to push back from the gate, the physical movement mirroring the emotional shift that had already occurred. And the woman allowed herself a slow breath, not because she had been holding one, but because moments of confrontation always demanded a reset, and she looked out the small, oval window as the terminal slid past, reflecting on how quickly spaces transformed when truth entered them, how an aisle could become a stage, how silence could be mistaken for weakness until it revealed itself as discipline. And the passengers settled into the routines of flight, adjusting vents, stowing devices, resuming conversations that felt tentative now, softened by the awareness that something meaningful had just unfolded among them. And a man a few rows back caught her eye and nodded once, a simple acknowledgement without words, and she returned it, understanding that gestures like that were not declarations but signals, quiet indicators that lines had been crossed and noticed. And as the plane taxied, the announcement for departure procedures played over the speakers, its normalcy almost jarring against what had just occurred. But that contrast was part of the lesson, because systems often continued as if nothing had happened, even when individuals had been forced to confront themselves. And she thought again of the countless rooms she had entered where she had been underestimated, of the time she had been asked to prove herself before being allowed to contribute, and of how rarely those moments ended with public correction. And she recognized that this one would stay with the people who witnessed it, not because of her title or her clearance, but because they had seen assumption collide with reality in a confined space where no one could look away. And as the aircraft lined up on the runway and the engines surged, lifting the plane into the sky, she felt the familiar sensation of ascent, the pressure change, the quiet hum of forward motion. And she understood that while this flight would reach its destination like any other, something else had already landed. Among its passengers, an awareness that dignity did not announce itself, that respect should not require credentials, and that the cost of silence was always paid by someone else. And as the city fell away beneath the wings, the cabin settled into flight, carrying with it not just people, but the memory of a moment when order was challenged, recalibrated, and quietly restored. As the flight leveled off and the cabin lights dimmed to their cruising glow, the intensity of the earlier confrontation gave way to something quieter but more enduring, a shared understanding that lingered beneath the ordinary sounds of air travel. And the woman sat back in her seat, gazing forward not in reflection of victory, but in recognition of continuity, because moments like this did not end when the plane reached altitude. They followed her into boardrooms, laboratories, briefing rooms, and policy meetings where the same assumptions wore different uniforms, and she thought about how often dignity was treated as conditional, granted only after credentials were revealed, titles confirmed, authority stamped and approved, and how exhausting it was to live in a world that demanded proof before offering basic respect. And yet she also understood the quiet power of restraint, the discipline required to let systems expose themselves rather than rushing to correct them, because when truth surfaced without force, it carried a weight that no argument could replicate. And around her the passengers settled fully now, the earlier tension replaced by routine. But the memory of what had happened did not disappear. It etched itself subtly into posture and perspective, into the way people looked at one another when they believed no one was watching. And the woman across the aisle who had apologized earlier closed her eyes, perhaps replaying the moment she chose to speak, realizing that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it was a sentence offered at the right time. And the man who had nodded earlier returned to his book, but his grip on it was looser, his shoulders less rigid, as if something inside him had shifted, and the flight attendant moved through the cabin with renewed confidence, her interactions warmer, steadier, as though she too had been reminded why policy mattered only when paired with judgment. And the air marshal remained watchful yet relaxed, his role fulfilled not by enforcement alone, but by fairness upheld under scrutiny. And the woman felt the steady hum of the engines beneath her feet, grounding her in the present, and she allowed herself to think of the countless others who had not been believed, who had been moved, removed, silenced, or ignored because their truth did not arrive with documentation ready to deploy. And she hoped that this moment, small as it might seem in the vast machinery of society, would linger with those who witnessed it, not as a story about her, but as a lesson about themselves, about the ease with which bias could masquerade as preference, about the danger of mistaking discomfort for threat, and about the responsibility each person carried in shared spaces. And as the captain's voice came over the speaker announcing smooth skies ahead, she smiled faintly, not because the journey was easy, but because progress often arrived in increments, one recalibrated moment at a time. And she understood that the true reveal had never been her identification or her credentials. It was the exposure of an assumption that could not withstand scrutiny. And as the plane moved steadily toward its destination, carrying its passengers across state lines and personal boundaries alike, the woman remained exactly where she had always been, grounded in her worth long before anyone asked her to prove it. And the lesson of the flight settled into the cabin like a quiet truth, that respect should never depend on revelation, that dignity does not require explanation, and that justice, when it finally arrives, does not announce itself with noise. It arrives with clarity, leaving behind a standard that once raised cannot easily be lowered again.